for coming. I'm Rogelio Miñana. I'm the head of Global Studies in Modern Languages, and I just want to welcome you all, especially our students. I want to obviously thank Christy Kelly for organizing this series, and our speaker, Joe Becker, of course, and Christy will introduce her and the topic of her talk, of Joe's talk. But I just wanted to mention a couple of things. One is, again, I want to thank all our sponsors and Jackie Rios for organizing the logistics and so on. And most importantly, I want to thank you for being here. I think this is a very timely and very important issue. So we're trying to do this for you guys more than for anybody else. We want you to be part of this process, of this conversation. And just talking about that, this is a talk that is part of a School of Education Colloquium series, but it's also part of the new GPS that we're organizing out of the Global Studies Department. It's called Global Passport Series, and many of you know already about this. But essentially, we're going to have, this is our first GPS event this spring term, and we're going to have a second and final one on May 11th. And the May 11th event is also going to be held at 5:30, from 5:30 to 7 p.m. It's going to take place in Nesbitt Hall, room 111. And the title of that talk is the Rise of Global Extremism and the Rights of Religious Minorities. And we're going to have experts on especially Muslims and Sikhs, and especially in the kind of incidents and attacks that they have suffered in this country. Also Jews, and I mean any kind of religious minorities, but particularly Muslims, Sikhs, and Jews in this country, in the US mostly. So that's going to be May 11th. You're all invited. I hope to see you there. And now, one last thing. I have to remind you to silence your cell phones. I know you don't use your cell phones anyways when you're in events like this, but just in case, just silence it, put it away, like smash it, do whatever you want, but make sure you don't use it. All right, so with that, thank you so much for coming. And Christy.
Thank you, Rogelio. And thank you everyone for coming. My name is Christy Kelly, and I'm a faculty member in the School of Education, specializing in global and international education. And this event is part of a monthly colloquium that we offer to bring different scholars and practitioners and human rights educators to Drexel to share their experiences and help us understand more about what's going on outside of the US around these issues. So we're really excited today to have Jo Becker here from Human Rights Watch. She came in from New York City to talk about her research. Just to let you know, this is also a live stream event, so there are people online. After the talk, we'll have a question and answer period. So we'll go back and forth between questions online as well as questions in the room. And then this event will be archived on YouTube, and so you can follow it later or send the link to your friends. Also, if you would like to tweet out about it, we have several handles, but please go ahead and use it. Joe's Twitter account is Joe Becker HRW, JOBECKER. So any kind of sharing of resources we appreciate. So let me tell you a little bit about Joe. Joe is the Advocacy Director of the Children's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. She's also an adjunct associate professor of international and public affairs at Columbia University. She founded, or is one of the founding, you were the founding chairperson of the International Coalition to Stop the Use of Child Soldiers. And I learned today that she also joined Human Rights Watch just as they were establishing their children's advocacy group. So she's been really one of the founding members of this field. She helps campaign successfully for international treaty banning the forced recruitment of children under age 18 or their use in armed conflict. Her advocacy also helped lead to a groundbreaking 2011 treaty ensuring labor rights for domestic workers, which number 50 to 100 million worldwide. She has conducted field investigations on children's rights all over the world, including Burma, Ghana, India, the United States, Uganda, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Morocco, and Indonesia. She's addressed the United Nations Security Council, testified before the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, conducted trainings for American and international military officers, and testified as an expert in a Dutch war crimes trial. She's written several Human Rights Watch reports, and her op-eds have appeared in the Washington Post, International Herald Tribune, The Guardian, and other major papers. She's also the author of a book called Campaigning for Justice, Human Rights Advocacy in Practice, which came out in 2013 with Stanford University Press. And her next book coming out later this year, also Stanford University Press, is called Campaigning for Children, Strategies to Advance Children's Rights, which actually has a chapter which will go more in depth about what she's talking about today. So we look forward to that book. And really, thank you so much for coming and sharing your expertise and time with us.
Thanks so much, Christy, and it's great to see you all here tonight. I'm really pleased to talk about a topic that I care a lot about, which is the way that education is coming under attack during times of war. When Malala Yousafzai was shot by the Taliban in 2012, the whole world knew about it. We knew that she had been targeted by the Taliban because she stood up for the rights of girls to go to school. But what I didn't know at the time, and maybe what you didn't know either, was the extent to which education has come under attack, not just for girls, and not just in Pakistan, but all over the world. When Malala was 10 years old, the Taliban began a violent campaign to overtake the Swat Valley, which is where she and her family lived. They believed that girls' education was contrary to the tenets of Islam. And in 2009, they put out an edict, basically banning all girls' education and telling teachers that they could no longer teach girls. A local Taliban commander went on the radio and said that any school that continued to educate girls could be bombed. That year, over 900 schools shut down or stopped admitting girls. 120,000 girls had to stop their schooling, and 8,000 female teachers were forced to flee. Now, attacks on education in Pakistan continue to this day. Since 2009, at least 867 schools have been damaged or destroyed, including 360 in the year 2015 alone. One of the deadliest school attacks ever happened in Peshawar in 2014. Gunmen entered a public school. They went from classroom to classroom, basically shooting down all the students and teachers that they found. 145 people died that day. The vast majority of them were children. Now, this isn't an isolated phenomenon. When Malala received her Nobel Peace Prize, she said, "I tell my story not because it's unique, but because it isn't. It's the story of girls all over." Now, the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, or GCPA, has found that there are repeated attacks on education in at least 30 countries worldwide. And we're not just talking about schools that are being caught in the crossfire. We're talking about deliberate and targeted attacks against both schools, teachers, and students. So, for example, the bombing, shelling, or arson of school buildings, or injuring, killing, kidnapping, and abducting teachers and students. In northern Nigeria, for example, the militant Islamist group Boko Haram has systematically attacked schools, has killed teachers, and abducted students. Like the Taliban, Boko Haram also believes in a very strict interpretation of Sharia law. Their name actually means Western education is a sin. The leader of the group declared in a video statement once that non-Islamic schools should be bombed and that teachers who taught so-called Western curriculum should be killed. Between 2009 and 2015, Boko Haram destroyed more than 900 schools across the country. Their attacks forced another 1,500 schools to close. And the group has deliberately killed more than 600 teachers. They've abducted more than 2,000 civilians. And you probably know the best known attack, which was in 2014, when they abducted 276 schoolgirls from the Chibok school that prompted the movement, Bring Back Our Girls. In Syria, this is the Chibok girls, but in Syria more than 6,000 schools have been damaged, destroyed, or are no longer operational. And the lack of educational facilities in Syria is one of the driving forces behind the refugee flows that we're seeing out of the country. I was in Greece a couple of years ago interviewing refugee families. And over again, refugee parents would tell me that one of the main reasons that they left Syria was because there was no future for their children, because the schooling was just no longer there. I met a 16-year-old boy named Adnan. He told me that his school was bombed. And so his family moved to another town, specifically so that he could continue his education. And within a year, that school was bombed too. And that's been the pattern all across the country. In Afghanistan, the Taliban and other armed groups have carried out more than 1,100 attacks on schools and education. They include the use of improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, landmines, suicide bombings, grenades thrown into school buildings, and rocket attacks, setting schools on fire. It's also included attacks on teachers and students, killing, injuring, abducting, and threatening teachers and students. There's a phenomenon in Afghanistan known as night letters, where teachers will receive written warnings at night, basically telling them that if they continue to teach girls, they may be killed. Now, armed forces and groups have a whole range of motives for targeting education. So one is that schools are often symbols of government authority. In some towns, they may be the only government presence. And with little or no security, they present a perfect target for armed groups that are trying to undermine government authority or who want to instill fear in the local population. Some groups, the Taliban and Boko Haram are excellent examples, try and block education because they believe that it's contrary to their religious or their cultural beliefs, and especially blocking girls' education. In some countries like Colombia, teachers are targeted because of trade union activity, and in countries like Iran, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, teachers are targeted to stifle their freedom of expression and academic freedom. We see that schools are also, they provide easy access to armed groups that are looking to recruit children as soldiers, or abduct children, girls, as sex slaves, or kidnap kids for ransom. And then we also see that schools are attacked when they're being used for military purposes by opposing forces. And I'll talk more about that in a second. Now, as you can imagine, the impact is devastating. These attacks are deadly. For example, in 2011 in Somalia, a suicide bomber blew up a truck outside an educational compound where students were receiving their diplomas, and over 100 people, mostly students and their parents, were killed. Thousands of schools have been destroyed or are no longer operational around the world. And when one school is attacked, it creates sort of a domino effect, because then other schools start closing in the area because they're afraid that they may also come under attack. So, for example, when in Yemen in 2011, when a pattern of attacks against schools started happening, more than 50 additional schools also closed down for months, and more than 200,000 students were denied their right to education. These attacks also lead to absenteeism and dropouts, especially among girls. Even when schools remain open, parents are often afraid to send their children. Children who are attending primary school in conflict countries are 20% more likely to drop out than students in other countries. Teachers may be under direct threat. They may be forced to quit. And as you might expect, many of them are reluctant to teach in areas where schools are being attacked. In unsafe learning environments, students are distracted. They may experience fear, psychological distress, be unable to focus on their studies. When children's schooling is disrupted, it also means that their opportunities start to diminish. If they don't graduate, their chances of getting a good job, economic opportunities start to be limited, and other abuses start escalating. So for example, many Syrian children have now been out of school for 6 years, and we see a corresponding rise in rates of child marriage and child labor among that population. And then there's the cost, not just the direct cost of having to rebuild a school that's been bombed or, subject to arson, but also the long-term costs of a country's economy being crippled by delayed education and the impact on economic development. A related phenomenon to attacks on schools is military use of schools. At Human Rights Watch, one of my colleagues, a researcher, first became aware of this phenomenon when he was doing research in India. He went to visit a middle school, and as he entered the courtyard, he noticed a clothesline with a pair of men's underpants next to a pair of military fatigues. And then in the courtyard, he started noticing beer bottles, bottles of whiskey. And as he talked to the principal, he realized that the principal told him that several years previous, a group of soldiers had moved in, taken over several classrooms to use as their barracks, and never left. In our subsequent research, we started realizing that this is a phenomenon all over the world. In the majority of countries in conflict, soldiers have used schools for military purposes. They use them for barracks, they use them for training grounds, for weapons storage, for firing and observation positions, for detention and interrogation centers. They often see schools as both convenient and advantageous for tactical reasons. Schools often have thick walls that they think may be good fortification against attacks. They're often the tallest building in a town, which provides a strategic advantage for snipers or for surveillance. And one commander told us fairly recently, the school, it's comfortable. Grass huts, life is hard. So the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack has found that armed forces and armed groups have used schools for military purposes in at least 26 countries during the last decade. So, for example, in Libya, armed groups used as many as 220 schools during the 2011 armed uprising. In India, government forces have used over 120 schools for military purposes as they try and battle rebel forces. In Syria, again, one of the most effective countries in the world, more than 1,000 schools have been converted into bases, military staging grounds, sniper posts, and detention and torture centers. Now, when this happens, some children are forced to leave school entirely. The entire school has been taken over by military forces. And in other cases, students are sort of crowded into whatever space is left over. So in Bihar in India, for example, we visited one school where the military had taken over 8 classrooms, leaving 3 classrooms for the remaining 700 students. Imagine what that learning environment is like. In cases where soldiers and students are trying to cohabitate, it can often create a pretty traumatic environment for students. This is a scene from Pakistan where children are fleeing their classrooms as military forces carry out an exercise. We've even found UN peacekeepers using schools. This is from the Central African Republic, although more recently the UN has adopted a policy saying that peacekeepers should never use schools for military purposes. Now, when armed forces use schools, it not only violates a child's right to education, but it also makes the school a legitimate target of attack, which means that every student, every teacher who is still in that school building is at risk. Beyond those obvious risks, the other impacts include damage to buildings. The UN in South Sudan found that after a primary school was used for military purposes, it cost over $65,000 to rehabilitate the school. We found in the Congo that soldiers were using schools and they would burn school desks, they would burn books, they would burn doors for fuel, for heat. They used classrooms as toilets. They looted school materials. And soldiers may leave behind sandbags, razor wire, and other evidence of military activity, which means that even after they clear out, opposing forces may still presume that the school is being used for military purposes and may still subject it to attacks. This is a school in Congo after soldiers were through with it. Now, not surprisingly, in these kinds of conditions, where militaries are occupying schools, performance is suffering, dropout rates will increase. Parents are understandably very reluctant to send their students or their children to school when military officers or soldiers are present. And in particular, they fear that their daughters may be at risk of sexual harassment or violence by male soldiers. Now, as you might expect, attacking a school is a violation of international law. But surprisingly, occupying a school for military purposes is not. So I want to spend the rest of my talk telling you a little bit about the response to this global phenomenon, and especially about an international campaign to keep schools safe during times of war. Until about a decade ago, there was very little international attention to this issue of how education was targeted during war. But in 2006, there was an incident in Afghanistan which became a catalyst for greater attention. This woman, Sophia Ahmadjaan, was she was the director of women's affairs in Kandahar. She was a teacher for 3 decades. And in fact, during Taliban rule, she ran an underground school for girls from her home, putting her very life at risk. So on one day in September of 26, she was leaving her home for work when 2 Taliban gunmen drove by and shot and killed her. The killing outraged the director of UNESCO, the UN's educational and cultural agency. And UNESCO decided not only to put out a statement condemning the killing, but also to initiate a research project to try and document how common these kinds of attacks were around the world. And so in 2007, they issued Education Under Attack, which looked at 13 countries that were experiencing attacks on school buildings, teachers, or students. They had also recommended more concerted action from NGOs, from governments, from UN agencies. And after the report came out, there was a series of meetings in New York and Geneva and Paris to bring together different actors to talk about what to do about the phenomenon. As a result, in the year 2010, a coalition of UN agencies and NGOs came together and decided to form the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack. They adopted several goals, including working to bring greater attention to the risks to education during times of war, to strengthen monitoring and reporting of the problem, to try and promote more effective policies to protect schools, and to combat impunity by making sure that perpetrators were being held accountable for these kinds of attacks. So since then, the GCPIA, we call it, has published reports. It's convened workshops to bring people together from the field to talk about practically what they're doing to try and keep schools safe. They've organized conferences, seminars, developed policy recommendations for ministries of education. And one of their major advocacy priorities has been to try and address this gap in international law that allows schools to be used for military purposes. So this campaign has led to a new political commitment called the Safe Schools Declaration that, as of a couple weeks ago, has been endorsed by 63 countries around the world. So I want to tell you about it. GCPIA began the work at this castle in Switzerland. They wanted to convene a consultation of governments, military experts, UN agencies, NGOs. As it happens, this is privately owned by some supporters of Human Rights Watch, my organization. And these kind individuals offered the castle for this consultation. My colleague, Bede Shepard, who organized the consultation, said, you know, we knew that we weren't going to make new international law, but we wanted to convey a sense of gravitas about what we were about. And we thought that a castle would do that. And in fact, some of the government officials that came admitted later on that that was one of the reasons why they attended. So at this consultation, they talked about this gap in international law and what to do. And there was consensus that trying to create a new international treaty probably wasn't going to fly for a range of political and practical reasons, but that they could draft some voluntary guidelines that would help armed forces and armed groups take concrete steps to avoid using schools for military purposes. So the process from there was to get a military expert, a former colonel from the UK Armed Forces, to start working on drafting these guidelines, and then go back to some of the same governments and military experts to talk about, are these feasible? Are these going to work? You know, will this actually help forces in the field stay away from schools? There, at a certain point, the governments of Norway and Argentina decided that they wanted to take leadership and really be champions for this process and lead a negotiation among member states of the UN to develop a political vehicle, the Safe Schools Declaration, by which governments could make concrete commitments to keep schools safe and to avoid using them for military purposes. What followed then was advocacy to build support. Members of GCPIA traveled to more than 30 countries around the world in all regions, meeting with ministries of defense, education, foreign affairs, to talk about their research findings, what this problem was about, and try and build support for the Safe Schools Declaration. Part of the advocacy involved developing public campaigns, social media campaigns. There is a student group in California that started a website and invited students and teachers from around the world to send in photos of themselves, holding signs in their native language with messages to world leaders about keeping schools safe and keeping militaries out. They got over 1,700 entries from 30 countries in 30 different languages. Some of these photos were then shared with governments by Twitter. This one is a Bosnian girl, and the tweet is going to the Bosnian foreign minister, urging him to join the Safe Schools Declaration. The campaign also put together images for Facebook, for Twitter, other social media platforms, graphics that were used, and we started tweeting to world leaders, including President Hollande of France, Justin Trudeau of Canada. And in many cases, this worked. This is President Hollande in February announcing France's endorsement of the Safe Schools Declaration. In May of 2015, the government of Norway hosted a Safe Schools conference in Oslo and invited 60 countries from around the world who all came to participate and endorse the Safe Schools Declaration. And what are the concrete commitments? Governments that commit to the Safe Schools Declaration say that they will collect data on attacks and military use of schools. They will provide assistance to victims. They will investigate and prosecute attacks. They will develop concrete, sensitive approaches to education. They'll commit to making sure that students still have access to education even during war, and that they'll take concrete measures to avoid using schools for military purposes. At the conference in Oslo was Malala's father. He is a teacher and a school principal from Pakistan, and he told the governments that were assembled there about how his own school had been taken over by Pakistani security forces and rendered inoperable. What he told members of the conference was that what has been done to our schools is unacceptable. We have to provide the same sanctity to our schools and to our educational institutions as we do to mosques, temples, and churches. So in Oslo, 37 countries signed on to the Safe Schools Declaration, and since then the number has grown to 63. Some of the most recent endorsers include Canada, France, Malta, Belgium, Andorra, and Armenia. And the governments that have endorsed are taking it seriously. Some of the concrete steps that they have taken on are ordering their troops to vacate schools, conducting special training for soldiers about how to keep schools safe, initiating educational radio programs for students who can't travel to school safely, and providing extra protection for students. For example, in Somalia, while students were sitting their final exams, they had extra security to make sure there were no attacks. And issuing orders making clear that soldiers who engage in attacks on schools will be criminally prosecuted. So we still have a long ways to go, but looking back 10 years ago, this issue was barely a blip on the international radar. Today, there are governments, the UN Security Council, the UN Secretary General, and a global coalition that are all engaged in addressing this issue and trying to find practical ways to protect schools. These are the 63 countries that have endorsed the Safe Schools Declaration so far. And the campaign is continuing to work to try and build that number as high as possible and get every government to make commitments to keep schools safe. So thank you. I want to stop there, and I would love to hear your questions and comments that you might have.
I think that we have a microphone. Is that correct, Jackie? So if you would like, maybe if you have questions, is it easier to have people walk down to the front to the microphone, or?
I can pass them
Okay,
around.
we'll pass around. And we can repeat the question from the front too, so. You have a question in the front
Jackie,
here,
this
in the
one right
middle?
here.
Hello. So
Hi.
I noticed the United States hasn't signed on yet.
No.
So are they making progress, or they're usually on the front lines of revolution and progress? I
Yeah. The U.S. has a funny history when it comes to international commitments related to children. So, for example, the U.S. has ratified the treaty that bans the use of child soldiers. But on the other hand, the U.S. is the only country in the world that hasn't ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is the sort of fundamental convention for children's rights. On this issue, we got real pushback from the Pentagon. The Pentagon said, we have the Geneva Conventions, we have international humanitarian law, that's sufficient, we don't want any more. And in general, the Pentagon's approach to new commitments has been to sort of keep their options open. They don't want to tie their hands in any way. And so even under the Obama administration, they were not very receptive. The US, the UK, and Germany are sort of three of the big countries that have sort of been lagging behind. So, you know, we're going to keep working on them, but they're probably not going to be the next in line to sign on. Jackie?
So then, with that, what is the implication for other countries signing on or not, since some of the sort of major powers aren't?
Yeah. That's definitely a big issue. And so we've tried to use peer pressure among governments to try and get more on board. So for example, at this point, more than half of the European Union has signed on. And that's a really useful way of pushing other EU members to sign. When we did social media campaigns to really push both Canada and France. And with Canada, you know, when Justin Trudeau was elected, he basically said he wanted to re-engage with the international community, he wanted to get Canada back engaged in UN peacekeeping, and they actually have a pretty good record when it comes to attention to children around conflict. So we thought, oh, this is perfect. So we started having meetings, and you know, time went by, a few months, a year and a half, and nothing happened. So that's when we launched a digital media campaign targeting Justin Trudeau particularly. And so lots of tweets going to Justin Trudeau. We gave him the heads up. We actually contacted representatives in the Canadian government and said, hey, just so you know, after Labor Day, we're launching this campaign. You know, we've been engaging with you for a long time, and we want to see you step up. And that prompted a really interesting phone call with their global affairs, that's their Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And they were having a conversation with my colleague Bede, and they said, well, so how long is this campaign going to last? And Bede said, well, how long is it going to take you to endorse the declaration? So, and then shortly after, we launched a campaign targeting France. And we know that Canada and France were basically in touch with each other. And they basically said, you know, if you sign, we'll sign. And so they both signed basically the same day. And that prompted Belgium to sign. France was the first member of what we call the P5, the permanent members of the Security Council. So that was an important thing. And we know that other countries are, you know, now thinking more seriously about it as well. One of the things that's interesting is that, as you can see, the endorsers are coming from all regions of the world. So you've got, you know, North America, Latin America, Africa, Europe, and it includes countries that have gone through real periods of armed conflict. So you've got Afghanistan, Nigeria, because they know, you know, what the impact can be, and they're taking the issue seriously. There's a question right.
When Malala was accepting the Nobel Prize, she actually was interrupted by a guy holding a Mexican flag who was protesting for the 43 students that went missing in Mexico.
Okay.
So I was wondering if you've done any research on countries whose educational system has been affected by cartels as opposed to armies.
That's a good question. Yeah, I forgot I'm supposed to be repeating the questions for the folks that are live streaming or recording. So the question is, are we also researching attacks on education that are carried out like by cartels in Mexico or other countries? That's a good question. I should go back to the very first map where we're looking at where the attacks are happening. So Mexico is on this list, so that probably does take into account cartel attacks or other armed groups that maybe might not be considered more traditional parties to armed conflict. But I don't know the full answer to your question. Hi.
Hi. So earlier in your presentation, you said that one of the reasons education is attacked is because there's access to students for abduction, correct?
Right.
So then what do you have to say about students then who aren't allowed, or excuse me, children who then aren't allowed education and being more susceptible to joining militant extremist groups?
Yeah. So the question is, if schools are ripe recruitment grounds for armed groups who are looking for child soldiers or for girls as sex slaves, then how do you square that with, you know, you want children to be safe in their learning environment, but at the same time, that actually may be bringing increased risk, right? So, I mean, generally, you want kids to be in school, you know. Generally, kids who are in school are less likely to be recruited as child soldiers, are less likely to end up in child marriage, are less likely to end up in child labor. But there are countries or regions where militants have figured out, oh, if I want some child soldiers, I just go to the local school. So, you know, when GCPA put together recommendations for ministries of education, this is something that they took into account, which is that in cases where that's happening, governments need to track what the attacks are looking like. You know, are they bomb attacks against school buildings? Are they abduction attacks like in Nigeria? And what are the appropriate responses? So, you know, if a school is being targeted for abduction or recruitment, it may mean, you know, greater security around the perimeter, you know, at some distance from the school to keep militants out, but not actual occupation, which then creates a different kind of risk for students. So it means, you know, governments really need to pay attention not only to whether attacks are happening, but what form they're taking, and then what kind of response is needed.
I just wanted to go back to the first question. I was wondering, with the Pentagon, you're saying the Pentagon keeping its options open?
Yeah.
Is that so they can possibly occupy a school in the future without violating international law, or is that some other meaning?
Yeah, exactly. So what's the rationale for the Pentagon lawyers who want to keep their options open? Military lawyers are really good at thinking about scenarios, things that may happen. So for example, maybe they're engaged in a conflict and they don't have other facilities available. Maybe the school is the only place where they believe that it's viable to shelter soldiers for a night or something. They don't want to sign a commitment that's going to open themselves up to criticism if they do that. They also tend to say, well, we have Geneva Conventions, we have international law, this is spelled out. What you're talking about is a voluntary commitment. We think existing law is good enough. So, what we would say to that is that the Safe Schools Declaration doesn't change international law, but it does provide some concrete guidance for how governments that are really committed to education can go further and take concrete steps to protect schools. And I think we would also say that the kinds of scenarios that these lawyers are coming up with, where there may be a scene where a school is their only option, is not that common, and that it's actually much more important to preserve education for millions of children around the world than to consider military expediency for those, unusual circumstances.
Just to note, you don't have to repeat yourself. They can hear you.
Okay, great.
Hello. First off, I wanted to thank you for all your work. And what you do is really inspiring. Your dedication and commitment to education inspires all of us to sort of find and use our voice. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I was curious about some of the methods you use to collect data in your research on military use of schools. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah. So there's a little bit of a difference between Human Rights Watch and the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, and also other UN sources. So I'll talk first about Human Rights Watch. Since 2009, we have sent researchers into countries where there's conflict to collect direct testimony from students, teachers, and parents, as well as school officials, about the phenomenon of attacks on education and military use of schools. I think it actually began earlier than that, in 2003 in Afghanistan. That was probably our first report. So we've done, fairly almost book-length reports collecting these stories and drawing a picture of what's happening in different countries. So we've done this in India, in Thailand, in Afghanistan, in Nigeria. Just in the last month, we released new reports on the Central African Republic and on Pakistan. So that's fairly in-depth reporting. The United Nations does its own reporting on attacks on schools and educational personnel. And this is because about 3-4 years ago, the UN Security Council decided that they needed to give more attention. And so they asked the UN Secretary General to issue, well, he was already issuing an annual report where he listed governments and armed groups that were recruiting child soldiers and responsible for killing and maiming children and attacks on hospitals. And so he also asked them to add attacks on education to that list. So every year now, around June, it should be coming out in a couple of months, the Secretary General will issue a list. And that's based on information that is collected by the United Nations personnel on the ground in about 14 or 15 countries where conflict is going on. And then the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack puts out global reports about every 4 years where they collect all this data. They look at the reports that Human Rights Watch issues, reports of Save the Children from UNHCR, UNESCO, UNICEF, the UN reports from the Secretary General, media reports to try and compile as much information as possible to paint a global picture. So that's where this map comes from, for example. So there's different documentation that happens in different ways.
So you mentioned how different countries like Afghanistan and the DRC have already signed on to this this program, how well do you think they'll fare compared to other countries, because their education system's kind of at the center of violence and oppression in their system already?
Yeah, so for countries that are in conflict, it's going to be a bit more challenging because, for example, we've found governments that have signed on where maybe the orders haven't filtered down through the chain of command in the military. And there may be a local commander that is using a school for military purposes, even though, the central government has declared that they don't condone that and actively discourage it. So, there are some hiccups. And, even the UN, it actually adopted its policy in 2012, saying that UN peacekeepers should never use schools for military purposes. But that photo I showed you of peacekeepers in a school in Car was taken just a few months ago. So it's not just individual governments that are sort of, struggling to make this a reality, but the UN is also. But we're definitely seeing progress. And even just raising the issue is creating change. So a few years ago, Human Rights Watch did an investigation in Yemen, and we found that one of the fighting factions had been occupying 15 schools. And for them, they weren't, they thought, oh, well, of course, there's a school, it's a good place to have our operations, why not? And, when we sort of put together our documentation, we went to the commander and we said, hey, this is what we've found, and you may not realize it, but the impact is that tens of thousands of students aren't getting an education. And, you're actually alienating local communities, and we sort of talked through some of the issues, and the commander gave orders to say, you have to leave the schools. In India, the Supreme Court has actually ordered security forces to vacate schools that they were previously occupying. So it's a process, but we're definitely seeing progress.
I guess I'll ask, is this working? I'll ask maybe two related connected questions. One is just generally, where does the Convention on the Rights of the Child fit into all of this? Because I don't know that it says anything specifically about soldiers in schools, but of course everything from a right to an education to a right to a healthy and safe environment is in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's always good when you have things that are more specific, of course, but I wondered where that fits in. And maybe my related question, you and I have both had the opportunity to spend time in Chattisgarh, and one of the things that I research is how development agencies use the idea of a rights-based approach to development to promote rights rather than promoting development. So that's what I was researching there and talking to the UNICEF and UNDP people about their efforts to speak to local commanders to get the soldiers out of schools. You have infinitely more field experience than I do. I wonder if you've seen this phenomenon in other places as well, with these UN agencies using the idea of a rights-based approach to development to take their own initiative in getting soldiers out of schools.
Yeah, well, those are good questions. So the Convention on the Rights of the Child was adopted in 1989 by the UN General Assembly, and it's a comprehensive treaty that outlines the rights of children to health, to education, freedom from exploitation, freedom from violence, trafficking, a whole range of issues. To this day, it remains the most widely ratified human rights treaty ever. As I mentioned before, the US is the only country in the world that hasn't ratified it. And so it does have articles basically affirming that every child has the right to free and compulsory primary education and progressive rights to secondary education. So governments that are strapped for cash may not be required to ensure everyone gets a high school diploma right away, but they're supposed to be working in that direction. And you probably know that in 2015, governments got together at the UN and adopted Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. And one of their goals now is that every child has the right to a full primary and secondary education. And that goal is set for 2030, which is, in the grander scheme of things, right around the corner. The convention also addresses armed conflict are entitled to special care and protection. It addresses the issue of child soldiers. It doesn't explicitly address sort of the intersection of education and armed conflict and the way that education is under attack. So, that's one of the reasons why the Safe Schools Declaration sort of brings those things together. And, like the laws of war, the Geneva Convention saying that schools should not be attacked, that applies in times of conflict. But a child's right to education applies at all times, whether there's a conflict or no conflict. So, governments always have that responsibility to ensure that children have a right to education. Now, the case of India is interesting. Chhattisgarh is a fairly new state in India. When I went there, some Indians didn't even know what Chhattisgarh was because it was sort of a relatively new state. And it was sort of the seat of this conflict between the government and a rebel group known as the Maoists or the Naxalites. And there's sort of this cyclical problem where the Maoists adopted this policy of bombing schools because the schools were the main symbol of government presence in many areas. And then to retaliate, the government would go in and occupy schools. And when the government went to occupy schools, then the Maoists had even more of an excuse to bomb the schools. And so you sort of ended up with this chicken and egg escalating cycle of violence that was, driving children out. My experience with the UN and using sort of rights-based approaches to development or using rights as a way to engage with commanders really varies country to country. We found some UN country teams to be fairly cautious. They feel like if they raise human rights too aggressively with governments or armed groups, it might put some of their safer nutrition or education programs at risk. There are cases sometimes if a government gets pissed off, they'll actually boot the UN out of the country entirely. So in some countries we see them being fairly cautious, but then in other countries we actually see them being, pretty assertive about using all the arguments that they have at their disposal, whether it's about, economic opportunities for children from schooling or their human right to have an education. Yeah.
When you talk about schools being a symbol of government authority, have you considered, or has anyone brought up the point that that government authority is like a reflection of Western ideology and like pillars of democracy, and not something that they are fighting against when attacking schools? Because I think that's like an important component to understanding like why education might be under attack.
Yeah. Well, schools vary so much from country to country, right? So in some countries, there may be a Western curriculum that is being adopted in local schools. In other cases, the schools are very much reflective of local culture and local, norms and values. So it's really impossible to generalize from country to country about what the curriculum looks like. And, we certainly see in some countries education that is not being used or is not being used for the best interests of the child, but it's being used for political means. So, for example, there are some madrasas that are being used specifically to cultivate fighters for the Taliban, and that's not something that human rights activists would want to support. The children have a right to a quality education, which should also be appropriate for, their situation. And that means that it should be free from political manipulation or, indoctrination.
I'm going to ask a question.
Yeah.
I'll take my prerogative. I know many of the students in the room are studying global studies with a variety of different majors. And I'm wondering if, to kind of take it in a different direction, can you tell us a little bit about how you came to do what you do and what is the future of the field? Like if students wanted to get into this kind of advocacy work, what are the things they might consider now?
Okay. Yeah. I'm old enough that when I was going to college, I had no idea that you could make a career as a human rights activist. That was just something that was unknown to me. And it was really in the 70s and 80s that human rights as a field sort of developed. When I was in college, I didn't know of any schools that offered, a human rights program, for example, that you could actually study. So, but when I finished college, when I was a college student, I was sort of an activist on campus and was involved in a couple of organizations that were working on women's rights and peace and justice issues. And those indirectly led to an internship with a national peace organization after graduation. So that's how I came to New York and spent about 10 years working for an interreligious organization called Fellowship of Reconciliation. I came to Human Rights Watch sort of by chance. I was looking for a change. I was interested in staying in the nonprofit field. And I knew someone who had worked for Human Rights Watch, and I respected their work. And my friend introduced me to the woman who founded the Children's Rights Division. And I've now been with Human Rights Watch for almost 20 years. But over that 20 years, I've seen a real evolution. When I first joined the organization, a lot of the people who were working for Human Rights Watch were people who were like me. They had sort of learned about, research and advocacy through trial and error. There weren't real training programs to figure out how to be a professional human rights advocate or researcher. Whereas now, there are dozens of programs around the country, around the world, where you can get, both a academic and also a practical, grounding in human rights work. Methodology, the theory, the law, the practice. And so today, a lot of our staff are coming out of graduate schools working on international relations. We have former journalists coming to us. We have lawyers on our staff. We do have, we're sort of growing our repertoire of issues. So for example, we're starting a new program on the environment and human rights. We started a few years ago a department on disability and human rights. We just hired a new researcher recently who's looking at the human rights of older persons. So we're sort of constantly trying to look at new areas. We have a health and human rights program where some of the staff have a medical background. So the world of human rights is becoming both more professional and more diverse all the time.
Thank you.
Okay, I know it's Passover, and some people need to leave by sundown.
Yeah, thank you so much again, and thank you everyone for an engaging conversation. And May 18th is May 11th, I apologize, is the next event for the Global Studies program. We also have another global education event on May 18th, so they're connected there. So if you're interested in learning more about human rights education and the rights of children to be educated about their rights, come back to that event. And thank you again and enjoy your evening. Thanks.